And now I am so pleased to introduce this year's Stone Lecturer, one of the foremost scholars in public administration, Janine O'Flynn. Janine O'Flynn is director of the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University, one of the world's leading interdisciplinary public policy schools. She is a public management expert, focusing much of her research on various aspects of public sector reform and relationships. In her various roles, she has developed deep connections with practitioners and the practice of public management. She is an award-winning researcher and educator, receiving Best Article Awards from Public Administration Review and Review of Public Personnel Administration, and several Best Paper Awards from the Academy of Management. She won the Best Book Public Nonprofit Award for the Academy of Management for her co-authored book, Rethinking Public Service Delivery, Managing with External Parties. Her most recent books, both released in 2024, are Pathways to Positive Public Administration, The International Experience, and a book on the Research Handbook on Public Management and COVID-19. She is a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration and the Institute of Public Administration of Australia in Victoria. She sits on the board of the Public Management Research Association and has held positions on various public sector advisory boards. Together, her various activities across research, education, and service and engagement seek to better understand how government works and contributes to improving the outcomes of those activities. Janine, we look forward to your lecture. Please join me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patria, for the generous introduction and also for the invitation to be here today. I'd also just like to take a moment to thank Bill Shields and Karen Garrett for all of their support in bringing me from across the other side of the world to speak today. It is indeed quite the journey. It is an immense privilege to be asked to deliver the Donald C. Stone Lecture and to follow in the footsteps of some of my extraordinary colleagues who have gone before me. In my lecture today, I'll explore some big ideas for the future of our field. In my view, we're in an increasingly uncomfortable transitional moment, and we need to ensure we build a human and humane approach in the face of an increasingly hostile world. And this seems especially relevant when the conference theme is about not yet robots, keeping public servants in public service. For 25 years or so, I've studied public sector reform and relationships, not only in Australia, but in other parts of the world. And I've learned a lot from looking outside my own country, but also from the broad range of incredible students that have been in my classroom and in the boardroom with experts from across the world as well. In the past, I've spent a lot of my time focused on mechanisms of governance and on mapping paradigms of public administration and management. But in more recent years, I've been drawn to the moral aspects of public administration and to what the foundations of a future field might look like. And I'll draw heavily on the second of those themes today. It should go without saying that I'm also going to be making some remarks about the unfolding developments here in the United States. There's intense global attention to what is happening here right now, and I'll draw on this to provide some momentum for the argument that the next era of our field will need to be built on very different foundations. As we move through big transitions and changes, and we seek to make sense of the world that we're in, more and more we'll need to look to new ideas to shape our future. This is a common activity as we react to what's going on in the present, look to the past, and also to the future. And today I'll hope to make the case that key elements of a new human and humane world need to develop. This is not some fully formed manifesto, nor does it preclude other ideas, but rather it's my assessment of the big ideas that are emerging in our field that will shape our future. As we begin, I'd also like to make a point of honouring those that choose a life of public service. When I was completing my latest book, Pathways to Positive Administration, at the end of 2023, I was working with one of my co-editors and good friends, Paul Ter Hart, in the Netherlands. We were putting the full draft to bed, getting ready to send it off to the publisher. We were so inspired by the incredible contributions which had all focused on what could be achieved when government works well, with examples stretching from Bhutan to Burkina Faso to Pakistan and everywhere in between. We chose to dedicate the book to all who continue to believe in and work towards good government wherever they are in the world. We thought this was important in an increasingly hostile world with more turbulent times on the horizon. In a book that seeks to help reorient our field in a much more positive direction, we wanted to recognise those that do the good work, which often goes unrecognised and is increasingly under attack. In February this year, the Federal News Network published an open letter to the American people, written by career civil servants, setting out the many ways in which the work they do touches people's lives, from preserving the natural beauty of this nation to providing medical services to veterans. The letter included a plea. Valuing the sacred trust and the responsibilities you have vested in us, we are disheartened that many of you think we are part of a plot that works against your interests. Most of us heeded a call to serve because we love this country and what it represents as much as you do, and we wanted to give back. The hard work we do on your behalf. When you doubt our commitment, please keep this in mind. We are not your enemies. How did we come to this? While our dedication was to all, I did want to take a moment here, especially at the American Society for Public Administration, to dedicate my lecture today to those who are serving with commitment and courage across the United States, and to acknowledge the many ways in which they have and will continue to make a profound difference in their communities, their nation, and across the world. We see you and we thank you. It is humbling indeed to be invited to deliver the Stone Lecture. His career was an exemplar of the notion of public service. Across his life, he contributed widely, including to the implementation of the Marshall Plan for Europe, the organisation of the Executive Office of the President of the United States, and to UNESCO, alongside roles at Springfield College, the University of Pittsburgh, and Carnegie Mellon. For Stone, public service was a calling and an expression of American idealism. He espoused values that continue to shape public service thinking: a commitment to non-political and non-partisan professionalism, responsive and efficient government, and the importance of well-qualified, competent managers. His influence on the professionalisation of public management in the United States has been widely recognised, and throughout his career he drew scholarly and practice communities together, and he championed the development of a distinctive field of public administration, not one subservient to others, but a distinctive field of its own. And his values and his efforts help to shape public administration today. And his principles sit at the core of the American Society of Public Administration, which he helped to co-found in 1939. And today I'll speak with that legacy in mind. It is surreal to be here in Washington, D.C. at a time like this to deliver this lecture. As is clear, I'm not an American. Perhaps my very, very big Australian accent gave that away. But I do want to make some opening comments about the turbulent times that we find ourselves in. I am a scholar of public administration and management who has a keen interest in developments around the world, including here in the United States. And like many, I've been watching with a close eye to developments here. It's fair to say that between receiving the invitation to deliver this lecture and today, much has changed that shapes my remarks. I first came to DC in 2012 as part of a project I was working on with the Australian Public Service Commission and several academic colleagues. The aim of that project was to bring together practitioner and academic experts to try and design a new performance management approach for our federal government. It came with an extraordinarily ambitious aim. Could we drive a high-performance culture in the Australian public service? And as part of that project, we undertook a study tour, including here to DC. I was extremely lucky to get an insider's introduction to DC by my good friend Ed DeSev, who's sitting here in the audience today. I'd met him the year prior in Australia when he visited with President Obama. We worked together on a masterclass for public servants on joined-up government. And on the plane over, he'd read my soon-to-be-released book. He decided then and there that we were kindred spirits, and he was right. and we've remained friends ever since. During that trip, he introduced me to a range of important institutions in DC. I met with the National Academy of Public Administration, the IBM Centre for the Business of Government, the Government Accountability Office, the Office of Management and Budget, the Government Performance Coalition, and several federal agencies. Each were incredibly generous with their time and keen to know more about our work. It was here I learned how Australia had provided some inspiration for reforms in the United States, just as we had borrowed heavily from our US colleagues as well. I also learnt here that people spoke my language. They cared about public service, they talked about mission and performance, and they were deeply committed to creating public value. They cared deeply about building effective institutions to do the work of government for the good of the people. They knew that the system had problems, weaknesses, and dysfunctions, but they were wholly committed to addressing these. The initial visit shaped my thinking in many ways and for many years to come. To come to DC now seems like another world. Colleagues are operating in an increasingly hostile environment, and the frantic pace of announcements is almost impossible to keep up with. Earlier this week, I was able to explore the extraordinary National Museum of African American History and Culture. Ironically, at the same time that day, an executive order was issued, which will impact the Smithsonian institutions to restore truth and sanity to American history and position them as quote unquote inspiration and as symbols of inspiration and American greatness. Despite this frantic pace, we do have colleagues who are trying to keep up, cataloguing, commenting, and reporting on these across social and traditional media, as well as setting us up for the longer run analysis and assessment of what is to come. But the language and the landscape is transformed, rupturing the well known institutional architecture of government, and this is playing out at hyperspeed. Last month in the New York Times, Tressie McMillan Cottom described the ensuing chaos as content for the Trump show, arguing the aim was to demoralise the federal bureaucracy. In her op ed just 2 days ago, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said, "Today they are not reinventing government, they are wrecking it." I want to draw out a few examples that symbolise this increasingly hostile environment through patterns of revolution, catastrophe, erasure, and trauma. First, revolution. In a recent podcast with Joe Rogan, not my normal listening, I will say, Elon Musk called Social Security the biggest Ponzi scheme of all time and explained his revolution against the federal bureaucracy. Normally, he said, the bureaucracy eats revolutions for breakfast. This is the first time that they're not, that the revolution might actually succeed. And he's blasting on social media about his revolutionary acts, posting on X that he spent the weekend feeding USAID into the wood chipper, labeling it a criminal organisation whose time had come to die. And he famously waved that chainsaw around, shouting, "This is the chainsaw for bureaucracy." Earlier this week, the Washington Post warned that Social Security was breaking, with cuts exacerbating old problems and creating new ones. A crisis is at hand. Websites are crashing, phones ring out. Some field officers are operating without pens and paper and headsets due to purchasing restrictions. People have left and others are being pushed out, and former officials contend that this is an orchestrated chaos to crash the agency. In a recent blog on what's going on at Social Security, Paul Krugman argued the cruelty towards some of society's most vulnerable was all part of the plan, and that this was being led by a person who had identified empathy as the fundamental weakness of Western society. A little more on that later. Catastrophe. Whether through the Department of Agriculture's cut of $500 million in deliveries to food banks, which will impact the poorest Americans, through cutting aid to the world's most vulnerable children, or removing access to antiretrovirals that block HIV from developing into AIDS, catastrophes are brewing as the US government abruptly cancels or cuts funding and programs across the nation and the world. In the New York Times, Nicholas Kristof countered the claim made by Musk that, quote, "no one has died as a result of a brief pause to do a sanity check on foreign aid funding." He draws on examples from across South Sudan where people were living with AIDS, unable to get their medicines, and have died as programs were killed. These short-run tragedies may morph quickly into catastrophes in parts of the world where the US has long provided protection against AIDS, starvation, and disease. And cuts to vaccine programs will impact the rest of the world as diseases take hold and spread. Working with experts, Christoph estimated that 500 million people might die within a single year if the US cuts its funding programs for vaccines. Erasure. The war on diversity, equity, and inclusion is changing how we even see the federal public service. On PBS NewsHour, Don Moynihan argued that history is being whitewashed as images and stories of women, people of colour, and trans people are being purged from government websites and buildings. His blog from a few weeks ago reports that 26,000 images had already been flagged for removal from military websites, and that might grow to some 100,000. Articles about Native Americans were removed, as were those about prominent Black veterans and women Air Force service pilots. And this is being done under the guise that DEI is dead. Despite some restraints, Don tells us to focus on what and who is being targeted here and subject to erasure. This, he says, is the important point. And finally, trauma. Trauma can be an outcome of change, but also part of the plan. Speeches in 2023 and 2024 by the now head of the Office of Management and Budget highlight the point. In those speeches, he spoke explicitly about inflicting trauma on civil servants. Quote, "We want bureaucrats to be traumatically affected. When they wake up in the morning, we want them to not want to go to work because they are increasingly viewed as the villains. We want their funding to be shut down and we want to put them into trauma." ProPublica suggests this reflects his long-held view that government should be brought to heel by a sweeping, powerful executive branch. And Anne Applebaum's Atlantic article on regime change in February argued that the administration was seeking to reinstall a patronage system. To do so, she argued, the administration will first have to break the morale of the people who believe in the old civil service ethos. And on Friday in the New York Times, coverage of the so-called Doge playbook reported that managers in some agencies have been told to eliminate 40% or more of their staff. Cuts, they say, will jeopardize agency missions and destroy morale. A manager from the Department of Health and Human Services reported, "Our mission has been completely demolished." Trauma is a weapon in this process and is being inflicted in many ways. There are many, many more examples from recent weeks, of course, that I could draw on. But what we're seeing is a new language of governing. Revolution, catastrophe, erasure, and trauma, which is hostile and fuels turbulence or even chaos. For some, these represent a regime attacking its own institutions. And the reaction from abroad has been noteworthy. In Australia, for example, in a speech just last month titled From Servant to Partner, the Assistant Minister for Public Services, the Honourable Patrick Gorman, said this: "Tonight, I argue that all Australians, especially Conservatives, their political rivals, should cherish our public service. Australia now faces the most challenging set of strategic circumstances since World War II. Is it really the time to be launching an attack on the public service? At best, deep cuts will take our nation backwards, and at worst, deep cuts will make us less secure, less safe, and unable to shape the world around us. There has never been a worse time in Australia's post-war history to be launching a civil war on the public service." Our election, by the way, was called on Friday. Given all of what I've just said, it may seem strange that I want to move from this today to talk about themes of positivity, complexity, humility, and empathy. These all seem to stand in stark contrast, but I think we must focus here because these are the ways in which we can guard against hostility now and into the future we tackle the big questions of our field. So today I'll discuss 4 big ideas to shape future thinking. And to do so, I'm drawing on ideas from recent collections that Patria mentioned, as well as a series of articles that I was asked to write over the last couple of years about where our field was going. And alongside of that, I've been testing these with senior leaders in practice, which has really helped me to sharpen my views. I took the first shot at drawing some of these big ideas together in 2022 for a chapter on global perspectives for the excellent Handbook of Teaching Public Administration, edited by Ian Elliott and his colleagues. And I know Ian's here in the audience today. In that chapter, I argue that public administration was at an inflection point. Public institutions were coming under increasing pressure, challenges were intensifying, and there were pressing demands for transformative social change. At the time, some were arguing for a new manifesto of government, claiming it was broken and reliant on old models that could no longer cope. Innovative ideas were starting to emerge, providing relief from the more rational approaches which have dominated the past. At the same time, there are shifting foundations as a broader and more inclusive account of public administration is starting to break through. In the field, we are moving beyond the dominant Anglo American conception towards a much more multicultural public administration, a field that will hopefully be more inclusive of a greater set of worldviews and values. This, I believe, can change our field profoundly and for the better. For example, there's incredible work emerging on non-Western public administration, Buddhist models of public administration, and Islamic public value. And all of these are terrific examples which are broadening out our field. This was the context into which I sketched out some of these big ideas for the first time about complexity, humility, and empathy. And more recently, I've been weaving in the idea of positivity to provide 4 foundations. None of these are necessarily new ideas, but each is helping us to think about the future in new ways. And individually and combined, they emphasize much more human and humane aspects of governing. So let me speak about each of these in turn. The current hostility towards public servants and the public service is part of a decades-long negative trope about government. And of course, it has exploded here in the United States. But this negative discourse of waste, bloat, inefficiency, scandal, and crisis and corruption has influenced the hollowing out of the state in multiple settings over many years. We do not get everything right in the public sector. It is also true that we have focused exponentially more attention on what goes wrong rather than on what we get right. In recent years, a group of scholars from around the world joined together to advocate for a purposefully positive stream of research. These are not people who are ignorant of the problems of the public sector. Many of us have spent large parts of our career exploring every facet of governing, from crisis to scandals and failures and ethical dilemmas and more. In 2021, this group of 15 scholars published a provocative essay, challenging our colleagues to take a walk on the bright side. We asked them to consider doing research that was decidedly more positive in nature. And we challenged them to devote attention to uncovering the factors and mechanisms that enabled government to do things well. In an era of declining trust amidst a global pandemic, we argued that it was time to give more attention to the positive aspects of government. Negativity pervades public service discourse. Psychological biases, political opportunism, and relentless negative media fuel this. We are much better at finding faults and assigning blame than we are at actually recognizing success, understanding its underlying factors and learning from it. Positive public administration, or PPA, offers a counterbalance to that negativity bias, locating and learning from successes to drive positive change. Developing a more positive public administration is not only an important part of a research program for our field, but is also critical to providing a buttress against hostility towards governments around the world. It is absolutely our intention to disrupt this failure narrative. We asked our colleagues to consider joining us to explore the following questions. Why is it that particular public policies, programs, organisations, networks, and partnerships can do much better than others in producing widely valued societal outcomes? And second, how might knowledge of this be used to advance institutional learning and influence practice? A subset of us pushed this further, taking these questions to the world. We worked with 57 authors from across the world to produce a major collection on positive public administration, which was published last year. This collection delves into the foundations of this big idea of PPA and identifies potential practices and tools. It was an extraordinary project to be involved in, and it showcases examples of where government works from every continent across the world. I'm also pleased to say it's open access and free, so this is not a sales pitch. PPA is more than just a technical exercise, though. It is a normative approach that recognises the value of government. When well organised, executed, and held accountable, government can and does deliver essential services and create societal value that private actors simply cannot do. This requires skill, but it also requires heart, ingenuity, and perseverance. And it also requires a nod to history, as well as being open to the very idea that government can actually create public value. We are not alone here, and a renewed attention to valuing government has been brewing and gathering steam in the field for some time. In their book, American Amnesia, almost a decade ago, Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson lamented how the war on government has led Americans to forget how important it has been to their prosperity. They open their book with the following: the book is about an uncomfortable truth. It takes government, a lot of government, for advanced societies to flourish. Despite this, they argue, we live in an era of profound skepticism about government, where Americans have become less willing to acknowledge government's role in supporting freedom and prosperity. In her work on the value of the state, starting with her book The Entrepreneurial State in 2013, Mariana Mazzucato reminded us that government is value creating, even if it had been written out of the story of innovation and success for a long time. She has championed a view of government which goes beyond the idea of market corrector to recognise its role in catalysing success and fueling innovation. Government here fuels public wealth and value creation. This contrasts, she argues, with the narrower and often negative story of government that has constrained bold government action, shaped a negative perception of public servants, and created chronic risk aversion. Over time, she argues, this has eroded trust and confidence in the state. And starting with the fifth risk in 2018, Michael Lewis has shown us what happens if we don't understand the value that government creates and the role of public servants. He followed this with the excellent book, The Premonition, which looked at the COVID pandemic, and his latest, in conjunction with the Washington Post, is the book called Who is Government?, which profiles public servants and the incredible work they do. It literally landed in my mailbox the day before I travelled to the US. A review in the Washington Post last week said this: page after page, the book breaks down the cynical caricature of the federal government that has persisted over the years and has been amplified in recent months. It shows that far from being riddled with and corrupted by waste, fraud, abuse, and laziness, the federal government is, or was, filled with people working hard, people painfully aware that they're stewarding government resources and doing so artfully under tight constraints, all of whom who could be doing something else for more money elsewhere. And colleagues in the United Kingdom, including Ian, are pressing forward on a related project on positive public policy. This work is focusing on chronic problems, complex crises, and emerging challenges, and how we can learn from success and failure to inform strategic, systemic, and participatory approaches to government. In our work on positive public administration, we are challenging our colleagues to be much more holistic in their assessment of government. We are not asking them to abandon critical perspectives or to engage in a propaganda exercise, but rather to give some attention to when and how government gets it right. A more positive movement is developing in the field as a way of focusing on what government does well and drawing lessons from it. And this orientation is both more human and much more humane, bringing people back into a more positive story of public service. The second big idea I want to speak about is complexity. We are very quick to acknowledge that we live in an increasingly complex times, yet we're not very comfortable with it. We need to move beyond simply acknowledging complexity towards becoming more comfortable with this turbulent, volatile, uncertain, ambiguous world that we inhabit. We need to work out how to actually grapple with this complexity rather than trying to tame it. In many ways and across many systems, we remain wedded to approaches that rely on developing rational responses in an increasingly irrational world. Many of our governmental systems remain wedded to the ways of operating, where we develop standard rules and then apply them repeatedly on scale to address complex public problems. Of course, this has been a fundamental principle of bureaucratic organisation, which, for all the decades of reform in many parts of the world, remains the bedrock of public administration. And certainly, my point here is not to demonise bureaucracy, which remains powerfully effective for some activities, but rather to stress that we need to rapidly expand our capacity to work in a world where certainty and rationality are no longer the defining characteristics. Remaining wedded to this view of the world gives us, though, something magical, perhaps even precious, which is an illusion of simplicity and control. And perhaps these are desired in large measure in a world that sometimes feels completely out of control. But this leaves us prone to pushing complexity aside and focusing on the technical rather than the relational aspects of governing. And this has left many governments around the world poorly positioned to experiment, adapt, and cope with change, when these are the very attributes needed to deal with mega threats and polycrises. So, how do we deal with this? And how might complexity feature in a more human and humane approach to the future? Well, a complex world needs flexibility, adaptiveness, foresight, experimentation, and the engagement of what some have called unconventional expertise. Some groups, like the Centre for Public Impact, have emphasised the power of human learning systems, which draw together aspects like human insight, collective intelligence, judgment, humility, and empathy with much more relational ways of operating. Others have argued that problem solving mindsets, rather than those that privilege stability and rationality, should guide us. And Beth Novak has shown in her work on public problem solving that when public servants work differently, governments solve problems better. She makes the case for more adaptive approaches that draw down heavily on data, human centered design, collective intelligence, and partnership to work through what are seemingly intractable problems in much more innovative ways. And Matt Andrews' work on problem driven iterative adaptation is another example where powerful tools have developed to grapple with complexity. This approach, developed with extensive international experience and practice, shows that we can do public administration and management in much more iterative and context appropriate ways. And we can use these tools to break down and move through challenges. And the work that Ed DeSev has been leading through the Agile Government Centre here in the US is another great example. The Centre has been developing principles and approaches that seek to adopt mission focused, fast, flexible, and inclusive change that involves the public, rather than relying on hierarchical command and control models. Together, these types of approaches signal a movement towards new ways that allow us to grapple with complexity using practical tools. So, getting comfortable with complexity and embracing more relational ways of working should be an important foundation for the future of the field. The third foundation I want to talk about is humility, which connects to much more relational ways of operating, and it can help us in confronting complexity. The ability and willingness to reflect on oneself and one's actions, to be more open minded, to be able to identify and admit mistakes, and to have a willingness to learn are all important aspects of humility. Humility is in high demand in a much more turbulent world, even if we don't have the supply side of that story right yet. In a more turbulent world, it is much more difficult and much less useful to try and devise rational legal rules for universal action. In other words, our search for certainty is misplaced. In his work on human learning systems, Toby Lowe argues that in a quest for certainty in government, we became extremely fixated on measures, incentives, and targets. And in doing so, we often focused on the wrong things. He goes on to argue that this narrower view gave us a delusion of grandeur. And we often fixated on what we could measure rather than what actually mattered. Humility can be a sort of antidote for such pathologies and may help us to grapple more effectively with complexity. And we can think of humility in two different ways. Both of them focus on being much more human and humane in public administration. Firstly, there has been this incredibly interesting set of ideas developing about humble government. And this is being developed by colleagues at the Demos think tank in Finland. Here, policy making begins with an acknowledgement of uncertainty, and policy is seen as a continuously iterative process. Starting at this point means that policymakers can be more willing to change their mind as new information arises. Indeed, we would expect them to. And humble governments make it clear that they do not have all the answers, thus opening up space to become much more experimental. The role of government shifts, and it's about fully realising the promises made to constituents and involves shifts in power. Demos colleagues guiding this work tell us it can be hard for governments to say we don't have all the answers and to put genuine decision making power into the hands of the public and the workers who serve them. But they argue brave governments do this. Just let me repeat that line. Brave governments do this. In the world of humble government, government does not know best. Processes of learning can take place together so that collectively we find ways to help each person and each place to decide what is right for them. This translates into a much bigger appetite for engagement with community. And here we see some connection to the tools of complexity that I mentioned before: iteration, inclusion, and increased information. And such ideas really shone through in the work we did on positive public administration. The second way we might tackle this is in building a capacity for passionate humility in public servants. This translates into focusing on the humane aspects of public service and cultivating an ethic of care and compassion alongside technical expertise. In their work on passionate humility some 25 years ago, Yano and Wilmot stressed the importance of tacit, local, and experiential forms of reasoning and expertise, which are derived from lived experience. Passionate humility acknowledges that those we serve all have individual agency: thoughts, feelings, values, and beliefs and judgment, and that this approach includes them and their wisdom in the practice of public service. Here we see again links to some of those ideas around local knowledge and context in grappling with complexity. So, getting comfortable with humility may be more challenging for some administrative cultures than others, including my own. And it is true that one of the most common questions I'm asked when I talk through these ideas with senior public servants is how can they be humble if many political actors cannot? I don't have the solution to that one yet. And the final idea I would like to speak about is empathy: the ability to put ourselves in the place of another and to see the world as they do, and in doing so to understand another's feelings. Empathy has long been held up as a positive attribute in the field. However, in bureaucratic systems, empathy loses out by design. Bureaucracy's power comes from the removal of emotion and empathy by devising seemingly optimal rules and rational pursuits, thus ensuring that everyone is treated the same. But the pursuit of efficiency and equity can engineer out our capacity and space for empathy. Approaches like the human learning systems that I mentioned before and the work on the relational state bring empathy back to the centre. Here we see arguments about letting public servants be human and an emphasis on working together with constituents and communities. These approaches stress the importance of public servants building relationships with the people they serve so they can better understand their strengths and their needs. In some ways, this involves a bit of a liberation for public servants and for people. Rather than models that are built on control from above, trust shines through when we refocus on empathy. And with empathy as a foundation, a radical turn towards human and humane approaches could be built. This is an area that needs a lot more attention in our field, and I'm pleased that one of my colleagues is here today, Asil Masagalova, who did an excellent systematic review on empathy, which was published last year, and it's really leading the way in the field about how we think about that. Empathy connects with positivity, humility, and complexity in interesting ways. In our book on positive public administration, for example, we saw fascinating work emerging on the so-called cultural chameleons, public servants who adopted more empathetic and adaptive approaches to working with stakeholders, and in doing so were able to bring large-scale infrastructure projects to success by doing so. Like humility, empathy leads us much more towards human and humane approaches to public administration. Today, I've tried to stake out some big ideas to shape the future of our field. In some ways, this is a very prospective exercise, but these threads have been emerging for some time now from quite different directions. Of course, some of the ideas are not new at all, but how we weave them together might be. And this is, of course, how paradigms are built. Whilst these stand in stark contrast to what we're currently witnessing here in the United States, these are part of a much broader global set of trends that may indeed shape and reshape public administration. These paradigms are our very own means of making sense of the world, and they develop in reaction to what's happening now, to perceived weaknesses of the past, and to some promise of the future. When woven together, positivity, complexity, humility, and empathy can, of course, be mutually reinforcing, particularly as we navigate a hostile world and chart a course forward towards a more human and humane public administration. As I close today, I would like to draw on the work of Richard Curlin, who at the start of this century set out big questions for a significant public administration. He challenged us to think big and to take our role very seriously. Like Donald C. Stone, he saw a place for public administration as a powerful force for social good. And his quote here challenges us all to keep an eye to the big picture. We were incredibly delighted that together with Rich Callanan, who's here today as well, that Richard was able to contribute to our book. And I'll quote, "Public administration is a central part of the grandest of human endeavours, shaping a better future for ourselves and for those yet unborn. The institutions crafted to achieve human aspirations require administration, including public agencies. However, the measures of success is not at the instrumental level, but in its enduring value not only to those in a particular nation, state, or city, but worldwide to all who aspire for improved lives. We should take our role in society very seriously. The big questions of public administration must address how we make society better or worse for citizens. In our current time, to serve with courage and commitment is a challenge for many, and scholars and practitioners must do this side by side, working together as Donald C. Stone encouraged throughout his career, a legacy that ASPA carries forward. As my colleague Don Moynihan wrote just a few weeks ago, courage is contagious. So I hope that in coming together this week, we can help in some way to spread that courage around. I think we'll all need it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. The mic. Thank you. We have a few minutes for some questions. There's a mic that is going to go around. This session is being recorded, so please wait until you have the mic. Shift. Any questions? Oh,
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if this is on. As a public administrator, practitioner, thank you very much for your comments. I appreciate the recognition of the career. And my question really, is about if some of the opportunities to improve public administration are outside the hands of the public administrators at this point. And in terms of appropriations process and legislation and the public sector really dependent on a functioning democracy, to what extent can the administrators fill in for deficiencies in the democratic process itself?
I think that's $1 million question this week. Um, it is a very challenging time here in the US. I think it's good to look to how that's worked around the world. Um, Not all countries function like the United States, and public administrators work sometimes in extremely constrained environments to deliver public value, and they work out how to do that. There's people in this room who are extraordinary experts on things like street level bureaucrats and how public administrators in practice reach into these big complex systems with many challenges and barriers to deliver value to their communities and constituents. I suspect many of you who are practicing that art right now know the answer better to me. But I think it is a time for finding allies, and I've heard that spoken about several times during the conference. How do public administrators work with their colleagues in academia, in other sectors of the economy, to really talk about the value that's created, but to get things done? I think I don't know if I've got an answer for you at this stage, particularly about the peculiarities of navigating the current US environment. But I do think it's important to look outside at this time at how that's done in other places. And associations like this can help to spread, I think, some of that expertise amongst practicing administrators.
Hi, my name is Anne Braga. I work in the town of Brookline in Massachusetts, and I'm a third-generation public administrator. And I want to thank you for the insights that you provided. Do you have any thoughts on how we tell our stories better, how we tell our positive stories? Because stories, we know, are more impactful than data.
Thanks, Anne. It's a great question, and I know it's been part of the conversation here. I was in the opening presidential panel when we were talking just about this idea, and some of our colleagues were saying, we've been doing this for years. Why isn't it cutting through? And I think Sarah from the Volcker Alliance was saying that they're bringing together sets of communication experts to help get that breakthrough. One of the things that's been really fascinating to me over the last couple of years has been this brewing storytelling narrative. Now, in storytelling narrative, that sounds strange. Storytelling trend. There's actually an academic, a big academic interest in this at the moment in the field around the power of storytelling around policy. But I've strangely seen it emerging in the press, which is very unusual. Now, it depends what you read. I shared a short video with a very senior group of public servants in Australia last year that was done by the New York Times. Some of you might have seen this, and it's called Why the Deep State is Actually Sort of Awesome. Have people seen this? It's amazing. It's like 2 minutes, incredible stories of public servants and the work that they do and why it matters. Now, not everybody's reading the New York Times. Some people are reading other media, but I think using those channels, not for propaganda, as I said before, but to get those stories out is incredibly powerful. The book that Michael Lewis just did with the Washington Post is another fantastic example. These long form pieces written by extraordinary writers about the power that public servants have on our lives, the impact they have, and the incredible value that's created. And they do that in an extremely engaging way. He's now collated that into his book. I mean, I thought that his book, The Fifth Risk, some years ago is probably, and I read a lot. I get to read for a living. And it's one of the best books I've ever read on the power of public service. Oh my God, someone's coming for me. Sorry. Don't laugh. And it's an extraordinary book, which I've described to people as a love letter to the public service. Like, what happens when you open up those doors of agencies and find out what goes on behind? And I think illuminating those stories is very powerful. And so one of the slides I didn't include today was a set of these from around the world that are emerging. in Australia. I've got some of my Australian colleagues here today. Just in the last couple of years at the Museum of Australian Democracy, there's been opened a new exhibition there called The Spirit of Service. And in it, it has these extraordinary profiles of individual public servants telling their stories. I tell anyone who comes to Canberra, the nation's capital, on any executive program, to start there with their people. Take them there and help them to tell their story of what is the value that they create. So I don't know if I've got the answer for what the actual communication technique is. That's not my expertise. But there is a developing group in the academic world who are standing beside public servants to tell that story. As I said, we're not doing it because we think that everything's great and fantastic and we're engaged in some propaganda exercise. We're saying that the weighting of our attention has been too far for too long on what doesn't work. And we need to start understanding what it is that works and joining with our colleagues in telling the story of the great value that's created by the efforts of public servants.
That one question there.
I wanted to follow.
Ian.
What? Who's going? Am I going? Okay. Thank you. Jim Grant, City of Los Angeles.
What's up? Hang on.
Sorry about that. We've got a little confusion here. A couple of quick things I wanted to follow up on Anne's comments. I have a niece who had the nerve to tell me that I don't know anything about leadership because I've been in government too long. Worked alongside the press at LA City Hall, and they told me that we don't want to report your successes. Everyone's interested in your failures. So I'm going to suggest also, as Public Service Recognition Week comes up in May, that we title it The Rise of the Resistance and start telling our own stories. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ian Elliott from University of Glasgow in Scotland. It's actually a very similar point. I'm sorry I hadn't noticed you behind me when I stopped. But it's a similar point. So I mean that was a hugely inspiring presentation. Thank you so much. I think there's many governments around the world that are attacking public servants right now. It's not just in the US. It almost feels like it's a global phenomenon right now. And we all have concerns about our current public service workers, but I feel particularly worried about my own children and about the next generation. And how can we encourage young people to pursue a career in public service? And I wondered if you had any thoughts on the role that we as academics can or should play in encouraging young people to see the positive and to see a career in public service as something of value and merit when there's so much negativity and attack happening right now. Thank you.
It's a hugely important question, and I know that the work that the Volcker Alliance is doing this at a level, like in high schools and colleges and so on here in the US. I think the stories help. I'm a third generation. I can't really count myself as a public servant in Australia, but I'm an ally, so I will. But I come from a long history of public service in my family as well. I think it is really challenging, and we've had some. And I think you're right, Ian, in diagnosing this. It's erupting here at the moment, and of course, the media attention from around the world is on what's happening here in the United States. And so, but I think you're right, it's a much more global pattern. So in Australia, our election was called on Friday. We don't have set elections. It's a bit random when they might come within a particular time frame. And of course, we change our prime ministers frequently. And we've got, for all I said that was positive about our assistant minister speaking about not going to war about our civil service, there is that debate is happening in a way in Australia now, which is around potential for massive cuts to the public service after a very rapid acceleration and expansion in that over the last few years. So that's part of our discourse, not in the hostile way that it's happening here. I think young people are extremely motivated to make a difference in the world. I think we had some trouble in bringing them into the public service in many parts of the world because it was seen as, I don't want to use it as seen as sort of boring and what does government do. But once people understand the impact and the scale and what it is that government can do when it does it well, I think it's extraordinarily motivating to young people. And they see it as a platform for doing that. They might not come in for lifetime careers like we might have expected in the past. And they may move between different sectors because they're motivated by particular issues, whether it's around social equity, whether it's around the environment. And they will come at that challenge from a whole range of positions, I think. And we need to remind them that one place that they can do that on scale is in public service. I'm very lucky. I work in a graduate school where we have hundreds of students who come to us every year who are already in the public service and they're motivated to stay. And so I'm perhaps living in some wonderful bubble where all of my students are already committed, and they're looking for how can they upskill to really shine through and become leaders in the future. So perhaps I'm living in a different world at the moment.
Okay. Thank you so
thank
much,
you, Tria.
Janine. I want to thank Janine first. She made such a long trip to come here and deliver such insightful comments. I know that we are going to take with us those 4 pillars. Do we remember what they are, right? I know I won't test you right now, but you do know. And I am particularly inspired by everything that you say. And I have the pleasure and honor of giving you a plaque as a token of our appreciation for coming here and sharing your insight.
Thank you.